Hello, this video is all about text comparison, and it's comparing text types in writing. This is part of a two-part series, and you might have seen the previous video, which was an introduction to comparison, which talked about the key perspective we need to take when comparing something, which is the fact that we need to be putting them up next to each other and using comparative language as often as possible. In this case, we're taking that a step further, and we're going to show what that looks like in the composition of a formal paragraph. Now, when it comes to doing text comparisons, a common assumption is that we might be comparing books, and that's a fairly common thing that can happen in schools or in university. Someone might say, I want you to compare this novel to that novel, or I want you to compare this article to that article. Similarly, we might find that we're comparing two films, or comparing the book of a film to the film version. Okay? But it could also be the other way. We could actually compare a completely different book to a completely different film. Poetry could also come into it as well. You might need to compare a poem to a book or a poem to a movie. And finally, another form of poetry you could say would be music. But these are all different forms of texts, and they're all different things that could be compared or analysed. And I just wanted to start by really making this point that it's important that you think about the different types of text that you're comparing and how they're similar and different. It's not really reasonable to suggest that, because one's written on paper and one's on a television screen, they've got no similarities. You need to be thinking bigger and more critically in order to do this. So let's look at this idea of text analysis. When we do a text analysis, if you've watched any of the previous videos, you'll know that we need to identify a theme, which is talking about why the text was created and what message it conveys. We need to identify a technique. How does the text communicate its intended message? And we need to actually look at content as well, which is the evidence. Where in the text is this demonstrated? Now, when it comes to looking at two texts, we need to follow a similar process. The difference is we need to know the theme, technique, and content for both texts. This is what it might look like on a really basic level. Okay, here we've got a theme, our text 1 and text 2, and we've identified themes, techniques, and content in both of them. We're not just thinking on the surface. We're looking to compare themes. A good comparison is really looking to compare why the texts were created and the messages they convey. That's really important. We also compare techniques quite a lot, because while the message might be similar or different, often techniques can be a real driving point in how that message was conveyed, particularly when it comes to doing a review of something and coming up with a question of which text more effectively conveyed a certain thing. We'd be looking at techniques. Rarely, however, do we just look at this idea of content. It's really not about comparing content on its own when we talk about text comparison. Yes, it is a part of the analysis, but it's certainly not the starting point. Let me give you a bit of an example. Now, if you've watched any of my previous videos, you might be thinking I'm about to talk about a science fiction movie or something like that. But in this case, I thought I'd mix it up a little and talk a bit about princesses. More specifically, I'm talking about those classic Disney movies, Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. Now, if I was going to compare these on a content level, I might suggest something like, well, both have females in it. Okay, both films have females as their main character. That's a very surface level comparison. Going further, both of them wear dresses. Okay, again, a very surface level comparison. If I was looking for a surface level difference, I could say, well, the dresses are different colours. Now, here you can hopefully see what the problem is when we start to just compare content. Yes, they both have females. Yes, both females wear dresses, and the dresses are different colours. But if we're not talking more deeply about actually what this represents or what the message behind it is, then we're not reaching the level of depth and analysis that we need to for senior level writing. So this focus is not really appropriate. The problem is that it's shallow. It shows a lack of critical thinking, and it doesn't deal with the bigger questions. So let's give it a bit of a different try. If we're comparing it on themes, it comes down to thinking about what each of these stories was really about. For example, both of them had people in, fairly dangerous or unpleasant circumstances. We had Cinderella, who was essentially living in rags and scrubbing the floor. We had Sleeping Beauty, who was a princess, but she wasn't really living too well because the evil queen was all over her trying to ruin her life. But of course, at the end, they both meet their princes and they both achieve their dreams. So we could suggest that one of the themes or one of the purposes of this was almost motivation or inspiration, as though the writer wanted the reader to recognise that we can achieve our dreams and dreams can come true. You know, it's that fairy tale complex. You could also talk about the fact when it comes to these type of stories, there's a really strong concept of being moral, what's wrong and what's right. You know, we think about Cinderella being this really nice, lovely character, and even though she's treated really badly, she's still kind of very pleasant. You know, I remember scenes of her sitting in the basement. She's got friends who are rats and mice and whatnot, but she's friendly to them. The birds sing whenever she's around. You know, it rewards her nice behaviour. And there's a similar type of message in Sleeping Beauty, but in this case I think even more about that idea of the evil queen and how she's kind of completely in contrast to Sleeping Beauty, and I think she ends up getting killed or stabbed by the prince, something like that. Another one would be overcoming class barriers, but in this case this could be something really different, because if you were looking to find contrasting themes between these two texts, you could talk about the fact that, you know, Cinderella doesn't really start as a princess. In fact, she starts as kind of a slave, really, when you think about it. She's scrubbing floors, she's wearing rags. Sleeping Beauty, on the other hand, starts as a princess, so she doesn't really have this issue of having to fight her way up the class system and living like a slave. She always tends to live fairly well. So we can also see that some of the messages or intentions behind each of these is quite different, and that's a good comparison as well. So look, when it comes to actually writing about this stuff, you follow a similar process that you might have followed when you did analysis of another text. You identify the theme, you identify the technique that is used to convey the theme, and you come up with an example of how that theme exists within the text. If we're thinking about Cinderella, you know, we could say that one of the themes is being moral. And as we just discussed earlier, Cinderella herself is a character who represents being moral. She's a very good character. She always does the right thing. And as a result, she's rewarded for it, which teaches us that, you know, we should try and act like Cinderella. That's going to work out really well for us. And of course, when we're talking about our content in this case, Cinderella is the person that we want to speak about. You know, if we're looking to compare our texts, we do the exact same thing for Sleeping Beauty, and we put them next to each other. Being moral is actually a similar theme in both texts, and actually they both use characterization as well, so there's two similarities there. The difference in this case is the way that they go about using that characterization, because we reward positive behaviour in Cinderella through the character of Cinderella, where we punish negative behaviour in Sleeping Beauty through the evil queen. So let's now take it to the next level. We're obviously identifying both similarities and differences, which is important because a good comparison should have both. Now we want to put them into our structure of a paragraph, and in this case we're using our analytical structure, which has been covered in previous videos. We call it TEAL structure, and there's a bit of a quick guide here, though if you're not familiar with it, I would suggest going back to some earlier videos. We're looking at topic sentence, elaboration, evidence, effect, and linking statement. And in this case, the most important thing to remember is that in each of these 5 areas, I'm going to mention and compare both texts and whether they are similar or different. So you're going to see this in action as I go. I'm going to follow the same process I would follow with a single text, but I'm going to be focusing on 2 texts at the same time. So here we go. I'm going to start off by writing my topic sentence. And the topic sentence, if you've been through this before, is all about listing the theme. Now, if the 2 texts had different themes for my example, I would start by saying one text has this theme while the other text has this theme. That kind of business. But because they both have the same theme, that's essentially what I'm going to say. Here's my example. Both Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty convey the importance of being moral. I've stated the theme in both of these texts, and notice I use that word both at the beginning. That's my comparative language. My next section is my elaboration, and this is where I need to talk about the technique. Again, if the techniques were different, then I would have to explain each technique separately. But in this case, my techniques are the same. So here's my example. Characterization is used in each text in order to convey the benefits and consequences of moral choices. Okay, we get a fairly clear idea of exactly how the techniques come in and how they're showing it. Notice I've elaborated on that idea of the importance of being moral. I've linked it to this idea of benefits and consequences, and I'm going to unpack that in my evidence. So in this case, I'm talking about a difference. So I'm not going to be able to say both texts use Cinderella, because that's simply not the case. I'm going to have to talk about one text, and then I'm going to talk about the other text, and then I'm going to talk, one and the other. I'm going to be jumping between them, just like I did with the apple and the orange, if you watched the other video. So here we go. In Cinderella, the character of Cinderella represents good, as she is always caring, fair, and decent, even though she is treated poorly by others. In contrast, Sleeping Beauty uses the evil queen as a representation of evil, as she is driven by greed and jealousy. Okay, so notice how I've got two sentences there, one about Cinderella, one about Sleeping Beauty, and they both convey different content. We'll keep reading. Both stories conclude by reinforcing strong moral messages, as Cinderella, despite being downtrodden most of her life, is eventually rewarded for her morals when she becomes queen. Conversely, the evil queen is executed by the prince in response to her wicked ways. So here you can see again, I've used two different sentences, but you can see some of that comparative language coming in. Both stories conclude. I'm using words like conversely. They both concluded the same message, but they did it in a different way. So you should see, as I'm writing here, that the comparison is happening across each level. I now go on to my next E, which is the effect. So I'm going to talk about my interpretation. Now again, it's possible for texts to have different or similar interpretations. Either way, I need to make sure I cover both texts in this next section. Here's my example. Both Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty ultimately reinforce a similar moral message, which can be interpreted by the reader, suggesting that if we show care and gratitude in life, we will see benefit, while acting from jealousy and greed will ultimately mean our demise. So notice that I've kind of reinforced what I said in my evidence. I made it really clear that both of these had a similar moral message, but then I've also unpacked how each one was slightly different. Okay, I'm reinforcing the comparison as I go. As my last stage, I need to do my linking statement. And here's where, again, I need to mention both texts and how they've both achieved what we set out to do. Here's my example. In this way, we can see that both texts convey a similar message in regard to being moral. So what have I done? I've restated the fact that both of them convey a similar message. And I've restated what that theme is. So really look at this example as a way of throwing together all of those different elements, and you'll notice that in each colour group I'm still comparing both texts as I go. I'm not just waiting until the end. I'm not having one section that focuses all on Cinderella and one on Sleeping Beauty. They're constantly being put up against one another. So let me read through the whole thing. And have a bit of a look through this. You might choose to watch this a couple of times, or you might choose to write your own work and then come back and look at this example. Here we go. Both Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty convey the importance of being moral. Characterization is used in each text in order to convey the benefits and consequences of moral choices. In Cinderella, the character of Cinderella represents good, as she is always caring, fair, and decent, even though she is treated poorly by others. In contrast, Sleeping Beauty uses the evil queen as a representation of evil, as she is driven by greed and jealousy. Both stories conclude by reinforcing strong moral messages, as Cinderella, despite being downtrodden most of her life, is eventually rewarded for her morals when she becomes queen. Conversely, the evil queen is executed by the prince in response to her wicked ways. Both Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty ultimately reinforce a similar moral message, which can be interpreted by the reader, suggesting that if we show care and gratitude in life, we will see benefit, while acting from jealousy and greed will ultimately mean our demise. In this way, we can see that both texts convey a similar message in regards to being moral. Okay, hopefully you can see how that all strings together. I'll make the point that this isn't the perfect paragraph, and if you are actually conveying things from different texts, particularly at a higher level, if you're talking year 10, 11 or 12, 12 or university, the expectation would be that you're going into more detail, particularly in the evidence section, to really talk about the how, and you'd be incorporating quotes and particular camera shots or anything like that and talking more specifically about techniques. But that's going to be the guts of a later video. In this case, we're looking at how comparison is compatible with TEAL structure, and hopefully you've got a bit of an idea about how that works. Let's review our key points here. Focus on themes and techniques when you're doing a comparison rather than content. Don't compare things on a surface level, think deeper and more critically. Use TEAL structure when you're writing your comparison. It should be the same analysis as though you were doing a single text. You are simply adding the other text into each section. Talk about both texts in each section of TEAL. Make sure the comparison is ongoing and consistent. If you're able to master this skill, then you'll notice that the quality and the clarity of your writing improves. Hopefully this video has been helpful.